Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven and I'm joined tonight by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, how are you? Welcome back.
I'm doing very well. It's good to be back and good to be back in the show with you again, Stephen. Looking forward to the show.
And me too. So coming up later tonight, Keir Starmer responds to the Grenfell report. The Tory leadership race has seen the first candidate eliminated, and American Congresswoman AOC and Green Party leader Jill Stein have traded blows. Stay tuned for all of that. The Grenfell Inquiry has published its final report into the catastrophic building fire that caused the death of 72 people. It lays the blame for the 2017 disaster squarely at the feet of successive governments, dishonest and unscrupulous private companies, and a negligent local council. This was Inquiry Chair Martin Moore-Bick summarising those damning findings.
The simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. They include the government, the tenant management organisation, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, those who manufactured and supplied the materials used in the refurbishment, those who certified their suitability for use on high-rise buildings, the architect, the principal contractor, and some of its subcontractors, in particularly Harley Curtain Wall and its successor Harley Facades, some of the consultants, in particular the fire engineer Exover Warrington Fire, the local authority's building control department, and the London Fire Brigade.
So you heard there the wide range of bodies, individuals and officials whose, frankly, conspiracy of negligence has been found responsible for the deaths caused by the fire. But the report found three groups especially culpable. First, the private companies who sold the highly flammable cladding that accelerated the Grenfell fire.
We discovered that there had been systematic dishonesty on the part of manufacturers involving deliberate manipulation of the testing processes and calculated attempts to mislead purchasers into thinking that what were combustible materials complied with the provisions of the statutory guidance that advised against their use. That dishonest approach to marketing was compounded by the failure of two of the bodies that provided certificates of compliance with the building regulations and statutory guidance, the British Board of Agreement and Local Authority Building Control, to scrutinise the information provided to them with sufficient care and exercise the degree of rigour and independence that was to be expected of them.
Now, experts told the inquiry that by far the largest contributor to the fire was the Reynobond 55 cladding, added to Grenfell during its refurbishment in the mid-2010s. Made by the French subsidiary of US billion-dollar manufacturer Arcon, the highly flammable material consisted of plastic sandwiched between two thin sheets of aluminium. And despite knowing that the material had been implicated in building fires in other parts of the world, the firm continued to market it to British buyers based on a false statement about its safety. Several witnesses from the firm refused to give evidence at the inquiry. Other contractors are also implicated, including now defunct architectural firm Studio E, who the report says demonstrated a cavalier attitude to the regulations affecting fire safety. And Harley Facades, who supplied the Arcon cladding to the refurbishment project, seemed more concerned with the bottom line than resident safety. About them, the report says this. It did not concern itself sufficiently with fire safety at any stage of the refurbishment and appears to have thought that there was no need for it to do so because others involved in the project and ultimately building control would ensure that the design was safe. It failed to ask the kind of questions about the materials being considered that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have asked. It was induced to buy Reynobond 55 PE panels partly by its existing relationship with Arconic and the cladding fabricator CEP Architectural Facades, with which it was able to negotiate a favourable price. So, how did these private companies get away with such a negligent attitude to fire regulations? That's where the government comes in. Both the 1992 Tory government and the new Labour government that followed failed to heed warnings over cladding and fire risks. But it was the 2010 coalition government that created the regulatory environment that enabled profiteers to ignore safety standards. This was panel member Ali Akbar.
In our report, we set out how the government's focus on deregulation dominated the department's thinking, such that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. The deregulation agenda had a parallel impact on social housing, on the social housing sector, particularly in terms of consumer standards and protection for tenants. The effects of that can be seen in the many failings of the TMO, which we set out in our report, and which were not prevented or addressed by the regulatory system then in place.
The report highlights that in 2016, just a year before the devastating fire, the government was well aware of the deadly risks posed by highly flammable cladding, and yet it failed to act on that knowledge. But the rot goes back to David Cameron's coalition government. In 2010, Cameron launched his bonfire of red tape, slashing regulations in response to the financial crash. Eric Pickles, now Lord Pickles, was Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government during those years. That was the department in charge of housing regulations. The report describes Pickles, as well as junior ministers, enthusiastically supporting the deregulation agenda. That enthusiasm, it says, led them to ignore and disregard the safety of human lives, and the department displayed, quote, a complacent and at times defensive attitude to matters affecting fire safety. Also responsible for the disaster and its aftermath is the local authority, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and its tenant management organisation, or TMO. The report says this. Relations between the TMO and many of the residents of Grenfell Tower were increasingly characterised by distrust, dislike, personal antagonism, and anger. Some, perhaps many occupants of the tower, regarded the TMO as an uncaring and bullying overlord that belittled and marginalised them, regarded them as a nuisance or worse, and failed to take their concerns seriously. For its part, the TMO regarded some of the residents as militant troublemakers, led on by a handful of vocal activists. In the end, however, responsibility for the maintenance of the relationship between the TMO and the Grenfell community fell not on the members of that community who had a right to be treated with respect, but on the TMO as a public body exercising control over the building which contained their homes. The TMO lost sight of the fact that the residents were people who depended on it for a safe and decent home and the privacy and dignity that a home should provide. That dependence created an unequal relationship and a corresponding need for the TMO to ensure that, whatever the difficulties, the residents were treated with understanding and respect. We have concluded that the TMO failed to recognise that need and therefore failed to take the steps necessary to ensure that it was met. Residents were persistently ignored when they brought up fire concerns before the fire, and even in its immediate aftermath, Kensington and Chelsea Council failed those tenants. This was panel member Ali Akbar again.
We saw a similar failure to treat residents as people and as individuals in the aftermath of the fire, including in the way that those with religious, cultural, or social needs suffered discrimination as a result of RBKC's failure to prepare properly for emergencies. It was obvious to me from watching and listening to evidence being given at the hearing that there were two different groups of people, those who lived at Grenfell and those who worked for the TMO, RBKC and their agents.
Two different groups of people. Crucially, the TMO also failed to gather information on the needs of disabled and vulnerable people in the block, meaning no special arrangements were made for their evacuation in the case of a fire. The first report into the fire found that a shocking 41% of Grenfell's disabled or vulnerable residents died in the fire. That's 41%. And yet, 7 years later, little has been done to prevent this happening again. Hundreds of thousands of disabled and vulnerable residents of high-rise buildings still lack the personal evacuation plans recommended by the Grenfell Inquiry in 2019. That's according to the Fire Brigades Union, who say those residents continue to be at higher risk of death and injury in their own homes. The inquiry has also made a range of recommendations, basically reinstating the tougher regulatory framework over fire safety torn up by the Tories. They include these: a single statutory construction regulator responsible for the testing, safety, and suitability of all construction products and the licensing of contractors, a single Secretary of State responsible for all aspects of fire safety, a statutory requirement that a fire safety strategy be delivered for all newly constructed or refurbished high-risk buildings, and the establishment of an independent college of fire and rescue. Now, the 1,700-page report doesn't only consider the failings that led to the Grenfell fire. Inquiry Chair Martin Moore-Bick had also set out to establish, as clearly as he could, the circumstances of the deaths of those who perished. Now, that part of the report is really very difficult to read, containing a pretty detailed reconstruction of the circumstances in which each of those 72 victims died. But Moore-Bick drew this conclusion.
We are satisfied that all those who died in the building were overcome by toxic gases produced by the fire, and with expert assistance, we've been able to establish a reasonably accurate time of death in each case. We're satisfied that all those whose bodies were damaged by the fire were already dead by the time it reached them.
I mean, comfort or relief are not at all the right words, but that statement by the panel's chair, I'm sure, helped in some way those members of the victims' families or their neighbours, their friends, other residents of the building who might have had very different images in their minds of their friends' and families' final hours. The panel's presentation of their findings was a pretty forensic affair, but there was one moment where it was clear the impact the years of testimony had had on those on the panel. This was panel member Thoria Istefan.
As an inquiry panel, we have acted throughout with fairness, independence, and impartiality. That is what the law requires. At the same time, the losses so many people have suffered, and my involvement in this process has left a mark on me as a person and as a professional, which will last far beyond this inquiry. And although this inquiry is now ending, we know that for many people, their journey continues. We wish them strength for the future.
Inquiry Chair Martin Moore-Bick ended his presentation by reading out the names of the 72 people killed in the completely avoidable fire at Grenfell. Helena, I've spent my day, most of it, writing about this. I feel very angry, quite upset. But let's talk about the report. What are your thoughts?
Clearly, the biggest thing that comes out of this report is it just shows you where neoliberalism gets you when you have people within the private sector who champion it unashamedly, and they have their own people who are in government championing it on the other side as well. The biggest argument here, of course, is the difference between profit and how it can counteract with broad utility. For example, when you have a market transaction in a free market, externalities are things that have negative or positive consequences that do not have any relevance to the supply and demand of the initial transaction within that marketplace. So, for example, one of the big negative externalities we've talked about through the advancement of neoliberalism and the advancement of capitalism over the last 100 years is that of carbon, is that of the damage that we do to the environment. Because, of course, why would any company who, again, the sole interest of a private company is not towards broader utility for society or providing the public good. Its single desire is to make profits, to drive profit for its shareholders if it's publicly traded. And in the same way as we allowed companies to get away with dumping huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere because they did not care about the consequence of that, because it did not even make a dent into their profit and loss projections for the future, the same is true of what happened at Grenfell Tower. The sole reason as to why we're in the position where all of these people lost their lives is because a bunch of people who knew that having to take account of the social utility of ensuring fire safety was not necessary for them as private companies. The externality of the lives of humans, right? The negative externality that could come from this transaction of people dying in fire because of A, lax regulation, and B, the fact that their lives are not even taken into account when it comes to the market transaction in terms of trying to have the cladding installed on these particular properties. It shows the failure of this in terms of broader societal utility. Life is an externality of this people that is not taken into account by them whatsoever. And of course, that is what the private sector will always do. That is what the profit motive is for. You cannot change that unless you regulate it. Unless, of course, you do it via the state, in which they have a democratic mandate to maximize utility rather than do things for profit. But if you do have it done by the private sector, you have to regulate it. What else have we heard from the inquiry so far? Well, of course, the biggest problem, the biggest contributor to the lack of regulation is the 2010 to 2024 Conservative government, the bonfire of red tape that this was called. Eric Pickles, the cheek of Eric Pickles to try and argue in the Grenfell Inquiry that fire safety was one of the pieces of red tape that wasn't actually cut in this bonfire of red tape. The absolute cheek, when it clearly was true. And his testimony in the inquiry was totally rejected over fire safety being included in this. Just shows you the lack of concern that our elected politicians have when they are in the pockets of the industries who drive them profit and then put the money in their pockets as far as donations are concerned, and how their poisonous ideology of neoliberalism has left our society creaking at the seams. There's been loads of money made in our society since 2010. Profits have been very, very good. Has that translated into a better society where we protect people from all of the ills of capitalism, even from a regulatory framework rather than even undermining capitalism itself? No. If anything, people have died, our society is worse, our people are sick, and our schools are crumbling. Grenfell is the tip of the iceberg, pretty awful tip of the iceberg, but this rot pervades our entire society. And if this one specific instance cannot be the catalyst that changes our society for the better, so that we put the interests of people and the interests of our lives over the interests of private profit for private companies, then our country will continue down the same doom loop it's been on for the last 14 years.
That sort of attitude towards people that you expressed there in pursuit of the profit principle, I think it was so well summed up by Jacob Rees-Mogg, former Tory MP, who I think told LBC that the residents of the tower during the fire had lacked common sense. In other words, really implying that it was their fault, not the fault of the contractors who had paid more attention to their bottom line than they had to them. And also just thinking about that panel member referring to there being two groups of people, and he said the one was the residents, the other was the TMO. Another way of thinking about it is there were two groups of people. There were those people whose sole function was to be sites of extraction for these companies and for the council, and people who did the extracting. It's absolutely shocking revelations from this inquiry. And naturally, there's been a flood of reaction to the findings. This was Natasha Elcock of Grenfell United, a group made up of the survivors and bereaved relatives of the Grenfell fire.
Today marks the conclusion of a painful 6 years, listening to the advice that contributed to the deaths of 54 adults and 18 children. They were our loved ones, our neighbours, and our friends. Today's report speaks to the lack of competence, understanding, and fundamental failure to perform the most basic duties of care. We paid the price of systematic dishonesty, institutional indifference, and neglect. The government ignored warnings about dangerous cladding from as early as 1991. It knew the risks, but failed to prevent them, revealing the greed and profiteering of an industry that has been poorly regulated by governments over decades. It uncovers the systematic failings at the TMO and RBKC, which created a toxic, calculated culture which marginalised its residents. It shows the senior management at the London Fire Brigade knew about the risk of cladding fires, but did nothing to prepare. But above all, the judge concludes what we already knew, that every single loss of life that night was avoidable. Human life was never a priority, and we lost friends, neighbours, and loved ones in the most horrific way through greed, corruption, incompetence, and negligence. The recommendations published today are basic safety principles that should already exist, highlighting how the government's role, duties and obligations have been hollowed out by privatisation.
Now, the inquiry isn't the end of the road for the victims and families of the Grenfell fire. There are currently 19 organisations as well as 58 individuals under investigation by the Metropolitan Police. But the Crown Prosecution Service has said that no charges will be brought until late 2026 at the earliest. That is an unbearable wait for those who lost loved ones in the blaze. Speaking hours before the report was published, former Labour MP for Kensington and Chelsea, Emma Dent Coad, laid out what she thought needed to be done.
Most people, when I talk to them, they want to see people in jail, and that's not going to be, even the charges aren't going to be for another 18 months, probably, and that's unbearable for people. They just want to see the people who made those horrible decisions in jail. So we need that, and we also need in the recommendations various points which will then be kept to by the new government. We need them to implement them without question to keep people safe in their homes.
Family members of those killed in the fire have also been reflecting on the purpose of the inquiry. Bernard's brother, Raymond, lived on the top floor of Grenfell.
For me, I was really happy with what I've read so far. I still need to digest quite a lot of it, but for me, the fact that Sir Martin Morbick named the companies and the individuals that were involved in this, the lack of their honesty, which my family have been saying from the onset. He mentioned the greed. For me, I'm really hoping that the decision makers are held responsible for what they've done. And at some point, they feel the fear that I have felt, thinking of my brother in that building.
Other Grenfell family members felt the inquiry didn't go far enough. Hissam Shakir lost his mother, his sister, brother-in-law, and 3 nieces in the fire. Speaking at an event for family members and survivor, he said this about the inquiry.
This inquiry was forced on us. We had no say. We were not consulted. And like I say, to some it gives answers, and to some it doesn't do anything except it's put that extra nail in the coffin, as they say, or in the heart. Words cannot describe the pain that I have gone through, the pain that my family has gone through with having this inquiry running parallel to the criminal investigation. I've seen witnesses laugh, giving evidence, which burns me inside, how they can have the cheek to do that, knowing that they are partially to blame for what happened on that horrific day. You have other witnesses that didn't even turn up. The chairman has summoned this important person to give evidence, yet it just shows you how weak our law is and the benefits of this inquiry, what it does. I'm sorry to say, but it's been a joke.
Hissam's pain so palpable there. And I think, from my comfortable position of someone who wasn't directly impacted by this fire, I can understand the difference between an inquiry, which is trying to learn lessons and make sure it doesn't happen again and assign some kind of responsibility, and the criminal investigation, which I guess has to come afterwards and will prosecute on the basis of some of those findings. But that's a very comfortable position. If I was in his shoes, I think I would probably feel quite similarly to him. Natasha Elcock from Grenfell United also had a message for the Prime Minister.
Today, we send a message to Keir Starmer and his government. This country has been failed by governments of all political persuasions. Our expectation is your government will break old habits and implement all the recommendations made by Sir Martin Morbick's report. without further delay, because the time to address this is already 3 decades too late. For the report to be worth anything, it must be and bring systematic change. To prevent another tragedy like Grenfell, your government needs to create something that doesn't exist. You must become a government with the power and ability to separate itself from the construction industry and corporate lobbying. A government that prioritises and tackles the glaring structural injustices and social and racial inequalities of the people you serve. You must now finally make this the turning point for Britain. To the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, it's now on to you to deliver justice, to bring charges to those culpable for the deaths of our loved ones.
Today in the House of Commons, Keir Starmer has addressed the inquiry's report.
I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. The country failed to discharge its most fundamental duty, to protect you and your loved ones, the people that we are here to serve. And I am deeply sorry. Mr. Speaker, today is a long-awaited day of truth, but it must now lead to a day of justice. Yes. Justice for the victims and the families of Grenfell, but also a moment to reflect on the state of social justice in our country, and a chance for this government of service to turn the page. Because this tragedy poses fundamental questions about the kind of country we are, a country where the voices of working class people and those of colour have been repeatedly ignored and dismissed. We will look at all 58 of Sir Martin's recommendations in detail. There will be a debate on the floor of this House. We will respond in full to the inquirer's recommendations within 6 months, and we will update Parliament annually on our progress against every commitment that we make.
Helena, your moniker, No Justice, seems particularly apt today. Are the victims and survivors of the Grenfell fire ever going to see justice, and what would that even look like?
I, unfortunately, am very pessimistic on the chances of these people seeing any justice for 2 major reasons, really. The first of all is that in our society, white-collar crime goes unpunished. We saw this with Horizon. We see it with our water industry right now, where the water industry is flouting every single possible regulation. Are these people ever going to see any amount of actual punishment for the crimes that they're committing? No, and of course they aren't. And with Horizon, we spent loads of time chasing after sub-postmasters, yet will anybody from Fujitsu or anything like that, will they see proper actual being held to account for any of the things that they've done? I very much doubt it. And so I think that we'll see very similar things towards the people who've caused this to happen in the first place. And the second of all is that our politicians, I don't think they really care. Or if they do, they only care fleetingly. Saw how many politicians from the House of Commons walked out of the Commons for the Grenfell statement this afternoon. A real damning indictment on the kind of people who get elected to that chamber. And when it comes to the Conservative Party, first of all, right, all four of the Conservative Party representatives who were called to give evidence to the Grenfell Tower inquiry, all 4 of them have been given knighthoods or peerages. Eric Pickles, Gavin Barwell, James Wharton and Brandon Lewis, all of them have been given honours. What a damning indictment of the state of politics in this country. Of these people who could be so intimately connected to one of the disasters that we've seen, one of the most awful disasters that we've seen in this country for decades, to then be given honours in the honours list at the end of the year. It's an absolute damning indictment on the state of these politicians, especially within the Conservative Party. Those same Conservative Party who laughed, they jeered Jeremy Corbyn when he stood up in the dispatch box wearing a green tie to honour the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. That's the kind of people who end up becoming Conservative Party politicians, let's remember. And when it comes to the Labour Party, I think Keir Starmer's statement was pretty good. I was pretty happy to see that he seemed genuinely to care about the people who were the victims at Grenfell. But when it comes to the changes that we really need to see in our approach to how we deal with the problems that caused Grenfell, they also are having a deregulatory approach to trying to build these 1.5 million new homes. How many of these are coming from the state? Very little. They're just going to slash regulations and try and turbocharge house building. That doesn't sound to me like they're taking every single step necessary to try and beef up the regulations necessary to prevent these things from happening again more broadly, so that because the true justice for me, alongside punishing people for the crimes, is ensuring that no one could be submitted to it again. And unfortunately, when we have people like the Labour YIMBY group having a parliamentary meeting where it's being chaired by a private landlord company that also had to pay money to deal with the flammable cladding and things like that, I don't have the greatest of hope that these things properly change for the better. Keir Starmer talks about a public contract ban for the companies involved in this, but will they still be able to get private contracts? Will public contractors still be able to buy things from them further down the line? I'm honestly not, again, I don't have the highest of hopes. And if we had somebody in charge in this country who was properly in the interest of the people rather than being given money from people in the private equity industry, then maybe I would have some hope. But at the moment, unfortunately, I have a very pessimistic outlook.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about it either. But the wheels of justice turn slowly, they say, and, well, we can only live in hope. Priti Patel has become the first candidate to be kicked out of the race to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Her exit follows the first round of votes from Tory MPs, in which the former Home Secretary received just 14 votes. Topping the first round contest was ex-immigration minister Robert Jenrick, who got 28 votes, followed by Kemi Badenoch. Touted by the right-wing press as the favourite, she got 22 votes. Just behind Badenoch was another former Home Secretary, James Cleverly, on 21 votes, followed by Tom Tugendhat on 17. Second to last, though, was former Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride, who managed just 16 votes. Now, Patel's exit will have come as a surprise to many, with Mel Stride having been widely tipped to be the first knocked out. While serving in Johnson's cabinet, Patel was expected to someday lead the party. But her problem now may be that she's no longer right-wing enough to satisfy that half of the party, and too right-wing for the One Nation MPs. She went from the figurehead of the right under Boris Johnson's premiership, who invented the Rwanda scheme, to a persistent critic of her even more right-wing successor, Suella Braverman. Something else worth noting is that the two top candidates are both right-wingers, and perhaps that indicates that Tory MPs are thinking that the future direction of their party isn't anywhere near the centre, but in outgunning Nigel Farage's Reform Party. The remaining 5 candidates will now continue in the competition to replace Rishi Sunak, with a further round of votes taking place next Monday. The final 4 will then perform in Hustings at the Conservative Party conference in late September. There will then be another round of votes by MPs, reducing the number of candidates to 2. Those 2 will then face the Tory party membership, which is where the real upsets tend to happen. Helena, what do these initial results tell you about the current state of the parliamentary Tory party?
I'm incredibly surprised that Priti Patel was out in the first hurdle. I had my money on her being the winner overall, so shows you how much I know, clearly. But I think one of the mistakes that Priti Patel made, if I can take anything away from this, is not trying to be in good graces with the people who ended up being a part of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. What Priti Patel did do in the background after no longer being on the front bench was do a lot of work courting the membership through the Conservative Democratic Organisation. She's been incredibly active in that, trying to be somebody who would trying to appeal to the people, part of the Boris Johnson wing of the Conservative Party, to try and build a kind of popular base for the things that she supported, and didn't spend enough time trying to make sure that she actually got onto the ballot to be voted by the members in the first place by corralling enough of the Parliamentary Conservative Party around her. And if you can't get more support than Mel Stride of all people, then clearly that isn't a good look. When it comes to the other results here, Robert Jenrick, really? He's in first place? I mean, if that's the kind of person that the Conservative Party MPs are backing, doesn't really look very good for the future of the Conservative Party politically, because he's a bit weird, isn't he? There was I think More in Common did a bunch of polling on this when they did focus groups, and one thing they did here was a lot of people thought that whilst the Conservative Party were out of touch, they were out of touch because they had a really bit of weird kind of stuff that they were kind of obsessed with, especially Jenrick. Jenrick's the guy who paints over children's murals to be performatively nasty to them. That doesn't sound to me like somebody who's going to be a particularly effective political actor. I know the UK is a nasty country, but I don't think they're that nasty, really. Let's be real here. Let's be real here. And when it comes to the kind of people who are getting broad support amongst the MPs, who I think will absolutely get support amongst the membership, members from the right of the party, is that what will most likely happen, especially if it's someone like Jenrick or Badenoch, is that they will be trying to move the Conservative Party closer to Reform UK to try and win back the voters that they potentially lost. Now, first of all, I don't think that's going to go that well anyway. Only a third or so, just over a third of Reform UK voters at the last election said that their second choice would be the Conservative Party. They don't really come from Conservative Party areas. And I think a large proportion of these people were people who voted for Conservative in the first time in 2019 because of A, Boris Johnson, and B, around Brexit. I don't think these people are natural Conservative Party voters who can really be won back. And the second part of this, I think, is the reason why this is a bad political strategy, if this does end up being the case, is that when it comes to polling on certain issues, Reform UK voters way out of step with the rest of the population. When it comes to the riots and the kind of terror attacks that we saw a couple of weeks ago, the Reform UK voters at the last election were wildly out of step in terms of supporting or showing sympathy for the rioters, to whether they shame Britain or whether they are representatives of Britain. The Conservative Party voters were way out of line with Reform UK. Conservative Party broadly mirrored how Labour Party voters supported, were critical indeed of the riots that happened. Reform UK were pretty supportive. So there's a pretty big gulf between the voter bases of both of these things. It also comes true with other areas like in foreign policy. In fact, the only parliamentary party that had members who broadly rejected or voters who broadly opposed the reduction in arms licenses to Israel was just Reform UK. Conservative Party voters, again, had plurality support for the removal of these arms licenses as well. So the Reform UK kind of peak of how many people they could necessarily win an election, actually not very large. So the Conservative Party fighting with reform over a really small part of the voter base can only spell further electoral woes for the Conservative Party, especially if the Labour Party continue their rightward swing to want to win over the votes of Middle England. So we'll see. If this is the case, I don't think the Tory party MPs or members really know what their strategy should be. And they should be backing cleverly if they want to be getting towards an electoral footing.
I feel like you might be watching this leadership race a little bit more closely than me. I've only listened to a few of the campaign launches. Have you spotted any new or interesting ideas, not necessarily ideas that you're interested in, but that the membership might be interested in? Or are we just seeing the same things being recycled in slightly different flavors? I mean, it all seems like pretty vibes-based to me so far.
I mean, I've watched, I think, 4 interviews from the Daily Telegraph with the members, with people who were vying for the leadership. I watched Badenoch, I watched Cleverly, I watched Mel Stride, and I've watched a lot of Robert Jenrick's content as well. And it is all just recycled stuff. We weren't conservative enough. We didn't go really hard on neoliberalism. I think we went pretty hard, mate. I know Boris Johnson was a little bit of a break with the Conservative Party's economic tradition on state intervention, but he was an outlier, and he kind of got his project halted by the pandemic and the war in Ukraine and his own personal narcissism and inability to be able to carry himself as a political actor. But it was just, we were too left wing. Well, no, you lost because you were too right wing, not on culture war issues. In fact, the more that you bring up culture war issues, like, I don't know, getting into slap fights on the internet with David Tennant or banging on about the Rwanda plan, the further they seemed to be away from the voters' real concerns, which was the NHS, it was public services, and it was the cost of living. In every single poll, this was shown amongst Conservative, Lib Dem, Labour, Green voters. Again, only Reform UK seemed to massively care about immigration. It's a really small part of the electorate. So all of these headbanger candidates banging on again about how we need to be properly conservative. No, you went too right-wing, and that's why you lost on the economy specifically. The only candidate in all of the interviews that I've seen, whether it's Mel Stride or Badenoch or Jenrick, any of these people, the only one who actually bothered to think, well, maybe actually people wouldn't have taken us seriously at all because they couldn't get an appointment on the NHS was James Cleverly. Like, he still kind of made it as if it was just their inability to govern that led to their demise. And I think that's part of it. But that can only be important when people's material standards of living have massively dropped. Again, the biggest drop in living standards since the Napoleonic Wars, and entirely down to the failure of conservative economic policy and neoliberal economic policy. So whilst I don't think Cleverly has the answers in terms of how to change the Conservative Party's approach to policy, he certainly identified the areas in which people left the Conservative Party over a lot better than people like Kemi Badenoch, who was busy getting mad about the civil service in a very kind of Liz Truss style rant in her interview with the Telegraph, in a way that Cleverly seemed just a bit more normal, just an actual normal human being who voters can connect with, talking about Warhammer, which that's something that people do in this country. He seems like a normal person, whereas the rest of them look like cranks, really, to me.
Yeah, cranks and weirdos. We've got a predictive comment from someone in the audience. Katie Marshall with a £2 super chat says, I can see it already. Last two, Generic and Badenoch. Put your money on that now if you want to. Now, if you like our coverage, then please do consider supporting Novara Media. You can do so at novaramedia.com/support. What you give us keeps us going, and that link is in the description. The US has a very rigid two-party state, worse even than the UK's. Independents and small party candidates rarely win seats in high office, though they do often compete at presidential elections, like the one happening this November. Now, US Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has recently been campaigning very hard for Democratic Party pick Kamala Harris. And she's somewhat tarnished her progressive reputation as a result. After all, the once radical AOC is now asking her supporters to vote for someone who has committed to carry on enabling Israel's assault on Gaza, pledging unequivocal and unwavering support for Israel's right to defend itself. Leader of the US Green Party, Jill Stein, on the other hand, has repeatedly called for an arms embargo on Israel to end the assault on Gaza, a proposition that's attractive for voters who, want to end the genocide. And in what's set to be a tight race, the last thing the Democrats need is a split in the vote. In a recent Instagram post, AOC received the question, how do I tell my friends who are Jill Stein voters they are wasting their time and effort? Here's how AOC answered.
You are the leader of your party. And if you run for years and years and years and years and years in a row, and your party has not grown, and you don't add city council seats, and you don't add down ballot candidates, and you don't add state electeds, that's bad leadership. And that to me is what's upsetting. Because if you have been your party's nominee for 12 years in a row, 4 years ago and 4 years before that and 4 years before that, and you cannot grow your movement pretty much at all, and can't pursue any successful strategy, and all you do is show up once every 4 years to speak to people who are justifiably pissed off, but you're just showing up once every 4 years to do that, you're not serious. You're not, to me, it does not read as authentic. It reads as predatory. I'm sorry, I'm just saying it.
Bear with me. I actually agree with AOC there, in principle. On a completely level playing field, it does seem to me to be pretty predatory for a political party to just kind of turn up and try to harness people's anger without having built a base on any kind of matters of principle. And I mean, I'm looking at you, Reform UK. But context here is everything. And genocide isn't just ordinary political anger. It's moral horror. It's being absolutely appalled by things unfolding in front of your eyes. And in those circumstances, people are naturally driven to do whatever it takes to stop that kind of crime continuing. And if that means abandoning the leader that's been pre-selected for you as a progressive voter, then so be it. But it's also worth asking, if you're a small party in the US, is the playing field anywhere near level? Jill Stein has now posted this reply to AOC's criticism.
I just wanted to thank AOC Pelosi so very much for her very authentic concern about growing green power. Clearly, AOC is the attack dog du jour, and the Democrats are running scared, and they should be, because who wants to support a genocide? Who wants to vote for a genocide? And if there's anything that's predatory here, it's saying that your candidate is working tirelessly for a ceasefire when actually they are actively funding and arming genocide and actually refusing to even consider an arms embargo, which would bring the genocide to a screeching halt. AOC, who's supposed to be in leadership of the Democratic Party, it's amazing if she doesn't know about the anti-democratic tactics and strategies that the Democratic Party uses to crush and silence political opposition. They've been hiring an army of lawyers to throw competitors like me off the ballot. They've been hiring infiltrators and saboteurs and publicly posting job advertisements for those positions. They've been hijacking our public funding in order to keep us off the ballot. And they actually impersonated the Greens to throw us off the ballot in 22 in the Senate race for North Carolina, for example. How is that not fraud and election interference?
AOC Pelosi, how do you even begin to recover? And thank you for your very authentic concern. It's worth pointing out that the Green Party has had important effects on previous presidential elections. In the 2000 presidential election, Ralph Nader won 2.7% of the popular vote. He was later blamed for spoiling the election for the Democrats, meaning that George W. Bush ultimately won the presidency in an extremely tight race. Helena, I think you told me on a previous show you've been a keen follower of AOC's career. The point of small parties like the US Greens is often to steer policy in a tight two-party system. So, on your interpretation, do AOC's comments about Stein suggest they're succeeding?
You absolutely should use third parties to try and steer policy, especially in very tight two-party systems. But unfortunately, I have to agree with AOC. This doesn't come by just running a presidential campaign every 4 years and forgetting to base build, forgetting to run in all different parts of your country and all different levels of legislature to try and make sure you build that base to affect policy everywhere that you can. I have always been some bit of admirer of the United States Green Party, from Ralph Nader to Howie Hawkins for quite a long time. I think Ralph Nader was an incredibly admirable politician, somebody who definitely speaks from his heart, and somebody who has always challenged the monopoly of US party politics. And his campaign, whilst in retrospect, he wishes that he had run for the Democratic Party in the year 2000, it was clearly something that came from the heart, something that he wanted to personally do to be able to try and, again, build a base for the future. What's happened to the Green support since 2000, since Ralph Nader? It's only gone down because they took what was a very large intervention in politics for a third party for a very, very long time, since Ross Perot, and they didn't turn it into local politics, didn't turn it into a way of trying to bring more people in. And that's only decreased since. It just shows you, I don't like Jill Stein. I don't like her very much at all, really. It takes a certain kind of person to want to sit at dinner tables with Vladimir Putin. This man, whilst you can have any opinion on the war in Ukraine, you can't. I don't think anybody can have an opinion on that man very specifically, unless the other one complete derision after for Chechnya and things like that. I wouldn't want to be in the same room as him, let alone sat on the same table to celebrate the anniversary of Russia Today. And of course, I don't think Jill Stein has particularly palatable political positions on plenty of other things, weird things like getting computers out of schools and children not being exposed to Wi-Fi signals, for example. She has great politics on things like the green transition, on investment in a sustainable infrastructure, on Medicare for all. But when all you're doing to the public is putting this to them every 4 years, in my mind, to do essentially an electoral grift, you're not a serious political party. Like, there are plenty of Green parties, plenty of other parties around the world in loads of different countries with similar levels of radical politics, right? You may say that the Greens in the UK are quite liberal, even if they have some more left-leaning economic policies. The Green Party in Australia are much more radical than plenty of other Green parties around the world. What have they done for the last 14 years? They have been running consistently in parliamentary elections, in local elections, in Australian state elections to try and get as much power as they can to wield hard power throughout the legislature, which is where the raft of policy gets made. You do not change policy just by running every 4 years. You fight in legislatures. There are over 500,000 elected representatives across the United States. The Green Party holds 140 of them out of 500,000. And lots of these only there because they ran unopposed. That is not an electoral fighting force. This is not a way that you change policy. When you look at the people who've had the biggest effects on trying to change the Democratic Party platform in terms of their support for Israel, the uncommitted movement, who have been the biggest force in terms of showing the Democrats that they cannot have their cake and eat it when it comes to support for Israel, is the uncommitted movement. This was internal to the party. These were people within the Democratic Party who wanted them to change their position and who used their internal powers within the party to try and change that. They, in my mind, are going to be far more successful at actually changing Democratic minds than Jill Stein just popping up since the last time she was in 2016. And also, she's not as good a candidate as Howie Hawkins in my mind anyway. I enthusiastically told people to vote for Howie Hawkins if they were in blue states in 2020 because I thought he was a lot more in tune with the problems that was really facing America at the time, whilst also seeing the dangers of somebody like Trump. And he admitted as much as well. So I don't think that she's a serious candidate. I think AOC's criticisms are warranted. When it comes to AOC, though, I don't think she's in the position to make as many of those criticisms when I don't think she uses her power internally within the party as much as she could do. She doesn't. In fact, that she's been folded into the power structure as much as she has. But that doesn't mean the criticisms aren't warranted, because there are plenty of Democratic Party representatives who have been outspoken. Did Rashida Tlaib leave the Democrats? Did Ilhan Omar leave the Democratic Party? No, they are still getting elected as Democrats to try and fight the internal party system themselves. You can say OC isn't doing enough work, and I would agree with you. I would agree with you, but she's actually an elected representative. She may not have had any particular change on this party policy. I mentioned last time she was one tabling amendments to stop funding the coup in Bolivia, right? Like she's at least trying to do things in terms of some policy because she's sitting actually as an elected representative rather than someone who pops up to do a presidential run without actually doing the work to build the base to make that a legitimate presidential run. Because splitting the votes to try and say, well, if you don't support us, then you'll lose the election. If you don't try and win our votes back, you'll lose the election, is a very legitimate political strategy to try and change politics. But that doesn't work unless you actually have enough people voting for you for it to warrant people changing policy. And Jill Stein is far, far away from that because there's no base. There isn't a base. Politics is about the exercise of power. Did Jeremy Corbyn leave the Labour Party over the Iraq War? No, he stayed and he tried to change things from the inside. And whilst I have no problems with people wanting to abandon the Democrats, there are plenty of other candidates who I prefer to Jill Stein. I like Cornel West. I like Cordia de la Cruz. I may disagree with you on tactics, but at least I think they're better candidates than Jill Stein, who don't have as many kind of skeletons in their closet. But at the key part of what I'm saying here is that unless you build a base, you don't have anything. And it's just a grift as far as I'm concerned.
That's a great argument, Helena. I think you convinced me. Right, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you, Helena, so much for joining me tonight.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Stephen. Always enjoy our streams together and looking forward to the next time.
Me too, and see you soon. And thanks everyone for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.